During the time up to April 24th, I will keep News of the Week going up on the website just as broadly and thickly as I have in the past, just in case there's something that helps one of your papers. Over the summer, I'm going to keep the website going, and anybody who wants to join me, please do. But I expect that News of the Week will continue, but have fewer items and only restricted to video games. So not as much of the broad IP stuff, because the reason I really put that up there is because it may help you with angles on your papers and things like that. So that part will disappear, but anything strictly about video game law will certainly be there. I will be teaching the course again in the fall, keeping the momentum going. So please, to the extent you want to, consider yourself part of an ongoing community and keep making contributions. Couple of just brief notes on special guests today. My daughter Dara is in the corner over there. She is off today and tends to want to come to my last class of the semester. She did that in media and entertainment law last year, and I will take it as a distinct compliment that she wanted to do it again. Also, Hamish Miller, who is a lawyer and a video game producer and just got back from his honeymoon, is joining us as a guest to just watch the course. Now, of course, the bane of my existence this entire semester. So today, we're doing something really low-key, ethics in games, which is meant to be just sort of a wrap-up in some ways of where we've been. There's not a huge amount of game content, and I'll sort of explain why at the end. And I think it'll make sense. It ties back into the very first talk, where the keyword for last week's reconciliation talk was creativity. The word to hold in mind through this is identity. And we'll keep coming back to the concept of identity. First couple of follow-ups. The Redigi case, which we heard about and discussed at various times, and especially in the context of international intellectual property law with Jaz Pirwal. And this is a lower court decision, but it's against the reselling of digital goods. So it is the initial lower court finding in Redigi. Whether it'll hold up when it goes to appeal, and I'm quite sure it'll go to appeal, we'll have to see. I'm kind of dubious that it'll hold up on appeal, but that's just a personal comment. Secondly, this is a subject we mentioned, and I won't say it was tangential, but it was sort of one slide. And yesterday, somebody gave a really excellent talk at the Berkman Center at Harvard that went into considerably more detail on how end-user license agreements and contractual terms can significantly constrain creativity and content, and did so in the context of the web. And the talk was called "The Web We Lost." It was very good. I will post it, as I'm posting lots of things, on the resources page on the web page. I will also, I probably should have done this a long time ago, do an index of everything that's on the resources page, because you probably haven't noticed, but I'm probably adding one video piece a week there, and it's just for exploration. But there's lots of good stuff there. Also today at 4 p.m., I don't know if anybody caught the first two, but they were excellent. Professor Terry Fisher's MOOC on copyright law. They're doing a live stream on appropriation art, and if the first couple of installments are any guide, it's going to be excellent. So I'm going to start with some things that have hit me. And, you know, you get, and we all do, you get these sort of categorized, these uncategorized stories that capture your interest, and you don't know quite what to make of them, but you know or you feel like they're important. So these are mine. And they go back over the last year. And some of these represent, just so you know how my methodology works, these represent pieces of paper that I keep moving from talk. You know, I'm looking for a place in my talks to talk about them, and they move from talk to talk to talk, and I refuse to let them go, but I'm not always sure exactly how they fit in. And there are more than just these. These are the ones that fit to what we want to do today, or what I hope we want to do today. You probably just want to write your papers and get out of here. The first one just captivates me, because I had no idea until I read the story that in Iceland there are approved first names. And if you don't have an approved first name from a list, you have to make an application to get that name approved, and it may not be. And it's a matter of cultural heritage, and it is that nexus point, I would submit it's a nexus point between creativity and identity, and it's just a very interesting phenomenon. Second one, did anyone see? Does everyone know who I'm sure I'm not doing justice to his name, but Ai Weiwei, who he is? He is a Chinese dissident artist and creator of some significant brilliance. There was a documentary about him that came out a couple of months ago, and he did a Gangnam-style video when everybody else did one. But his had a lot of quasi-political commentary in it. And it was done very creatively. It was very interesting. And it sort of threw me off for about 2 days. I was emailing everybody saying, what does this mean? And there's a very good piece where Ethan Zuckerman was wondering the same things I was, and had a lot better answers than I did. But of course, what it has to do with, again, is that nexus point between creativity and identity. And the sort of sub-connection to this, which is fascinating, is that different groups in Egypt were taunting each other with versions of the Harlem Shake. So we see how something like video games, in this case it isn't video games, but how cultural memes, and video games create more than their fair share of cultural memes, can become tremendously important and can be political. I asked a question in one of the previous classes, is all art political? So I'd re-raise that question in this context. And then to go full circle, in a sense, back to Iceland, there's a story from France. French Broadcasting Authority proposes cultural exemption to net neutrality. So net neutrality is good, but there will be certain advantages if you're a French company, and you might not have to adhere fully to the same to the same rules if you are culturally appropriate. So, I've given it away. What are the common denominators? Well, creativity, identity, constraints, restraints, censorship. Question, does identity and play equal creativity? Don't have an answer. Just a key question. So now, I promised you ethics in some description. So this is my version. This is not a quote from anywhere. But the more I look at these subjects, the more it is clear to me that ethics have to dictate law and not the other way around. And when law starts dictating ethics, as it sometimes does, it creates constraints and restraints that, because they are likely not appropriate, end up being repressive. And we see this a lot when it comes to creativity. So the argument is this is not a chicken and egg problem. We know what comes first. Ethics needs to inform law, not the other way around. Law can translate ethics, like into another language, into a legal language. But it is not to be conflated with ethics. Okay. So another principle through the course, restated for the umpteenth time, hopefully with some fresh material. Everything is connected. Creativity and identity get confused. They are separate things, and we'll parse them out. And you'll see identity is attached more to privacy issues, and creativity is attached to expression issues. But everything is connected. And today's versions, which are a little more complex, you change the tribe and the tribe changes you. Oliver Sacks, who's a neurologist, explaining that there's a reason we forget whether we created something or we didn't, and who did, and why we naturally appropriate the creative works of others, in a sense. Because if our brains could keep track of that, we would be overwhelmed with information, and our brains, in his submission, wouldn't work. So 2 minutes of Bruce Springsteen from SXSW.
For me and you. Yes, I know it's true. That's every song I've ever written. Yeah. That's all of them. I'm not kidding either. was born to run, born in the USA. Everything I've done for the past 40 years, including all the new ones, you know. But that struck me so deep. It was the first time I felt I heard something come across the radio that mirrored my home life, my childhood. And the other thing that was great about the Animals was there were no good-looking members. There were none. They were considered to be one of the ugliest groups in all of rock and roll. And that was good. That was good for me because I considered myself hideous at the time. And so, okay, all right, you know. And they weren't nice, you know. They didn't curry favor. You know, they were like aggression personified. It's my life. I'll do what I want, you know. They were cruel. They were cruel, which was so freeing. It was so freeing. When you saw Eric Burden was like a shrunken, like your shrunken daddy with a wig on, you know. He never had a kid's face. He always had a little man's face, you know. And he couldn't dance. He was like this. And they put him in a suit, but it was like putting a gorilla in a suit, you know. You could tell he fuck that shit, man. He didn't want it, you know. And then he had that voice that was like, I don't know, you know, Howlin' Wolf or something, coming out of some 17 or 18-year-old kid. I mean, I don't know how it happened.
All right, I'm just going to go a little bit ahead to 27:35. All right.
Someday I'll treat you real fine. I love that. Yes, 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 yes. You know. And then they had the name. The name was very different from the Beatles or Herman's Hermits or Freddie and the Dreamers. You know, the name was unforgiving and final and irrevocable. It was in your face. It was the most unapologetic group name until the Sex Pistols came along. You know, and Badlands, Prove It All Night. The Darkness was filled with the Animals. You know, I took youngsters. Watch this one. All right, I took. I'm gonna tell you how it's done right now. I took Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood. It's the same fucking riff, man. Listen up, youngsters. This is how successful theft is accomplished. And I mean, Darkness was also informed by the punk explosion at the time. I went out and I got all the records, all the early punk records, and I brought Anarchy and You Came, God Save the Queen, and the Sex Pistols were so frightening. You know, they were, you know, they literally, they shook the earth. You know, they were truly, which is different from shocking. You know, a lot of groups managed shocking, but frightening. Frightening was something else. There's very, very few rock groups that managed frightening. You know, and that was a great quality. It was part of their great beauty. You know, they were brave and they challenged you and they made you brave. And a lot of that energy seeped its way into the subtext of Darkness. Darkness was written in 1977, and all of that music was out there. And if you had ears, you could not ignore it. And I had peers that did, and they were mistaken. You could not ignore that challenge, you know. And of course, for me, those of course movies, films. That's another discussion, you know. But soul music is incredibly important.
So all of it and all the rest of it is on the website, and please watch it, and I hope I've given you enough of a taste. But everything is connected, and I just find the Springsteen Animals piece about as compelling a real version. And all the rest of the talk is very similar. So, a friend of mine who's an artist showed me a book on Sunday night, which had a really interesting take because we've been talking around this subject. And I didn't expect this. It was an art criticism book. And I talked, at various times, I talked about kind of the selfish model of originality, the Hollywood model that, you came up with the idea and the idea was yours and creativity was not shared and it didn't, and it was the opposite of what Springsteen said. And Donald Cuspet, in a book called Signs of Psyche in Modern and Postmodern Art, is a lot harsher than I am. More than ever, the narcissistic interests of those who make art count for more than the human needs of those who desire and supposedly benefit from it. Put intellectual property law through that filter and see where it takes you. I'll go to the less harsh place, which we've talked about many times. Is there a game without a gamer? And what is the role of the gamer? And what are the implications of that? And we'll go there, but Zohar.
Just wondering, just kind of struck me, and I'm surprised it took this long, but even if the creativity isn't actually original, the fixation, which the law is obviously concerned with, but also you can't consume something that hasn't been produced. So even if the creativity isn't as original as the person who makes the product thinks it is, if they took the time to make it and then it's being consumed, maybe we're really just protecting that more than we are protecting the creativity that we say we're protecting.
Fair point, and the point that the Supreme Court of Canada actually takes up. Because what they do, and this is sort of a little bit of where we'll end, is the Supreme Court of Canada says, no, this is a balancing act. This is a balancing act of the public good and making sure that creators get some compensation. But that was a switch in their mind from copyright, intellectual property as property. So there's a continuum here. And you may, by what you've said, move to that middle point of the continuum. And that place makes sense, because it's not all one way or the other, and ultimately you decide. I want to throw in just one small thing, and it'll come back again, and that is if you're into objective measurement of these things as an indicator of what should be done with intellectual property rights, then maybe it makes sense to look at any particular game, let's say, and look at how much of the game is in the corpus of the original work and how much of it is in the mods and other things. And in certain games, like Grand Prix Legends, you'll find, obviously, that there's way more work in the mod world and way more actual digital ones and zeros in that realm. And I'm not sure if that should be a relevant factor or not, but it's worth mentioning. Also, this is just a tiny meme in the course, but wanted to throw in front of you, in case you're interested, actual academic paper on intellectual property as neocolonialism, just so that you know that that thought is actually there. Now, this is a bit hardcore. My favorite philosopher, so I'll be unapologetic about that. But one of the things, and some of you have taken philosophy, know, is the test of what is moral and what is good rarely centers on the individual. It generally will locate itself in the question of what creates the most good for the greatest number. And when you start looking at the world that way, and you can read Parfit on your own, his notion, and I'm actually reversing them from how his books have them, there is an objective non-religious morality that is possible, and you can get there. It's not all subjective. It doesn't all break down. And secondly, when you get there, the barriers between you and others will fall away. And again, that's consistent with some of the thoughts around creativity, and does take me right back to modding and co-creating and the other subjects. So now here, this is the shocking semi-conclusion, meant to challenge you and for you to come to your own conclusions on. Is creativity as a human value more important than property? And I'm going to submit it is. Because creativity is intrinsic to the human condition and to human life. And property, at the end of the day, is a thing, a nice thing, a useful thing, but not intrinsic to your existence, to your happiness, and to the greater good. And if you're going to do the balancing act, and you may take the position quite correctly that intellectual property facilitates creativity, and that's a perfectly acceptable argument. But I'm going to challenge that if that isn't your argument, you have no argument. Because you can't put them next to each other and say property is more important than creativity. Zohar.
I think this is a form of the argument you just said I can have, but
go for it.
Is it fair to say that creativity, when it's not a part of property, is free anyways? It really is unconstrained because if you're not really doing anything with it, then nobody really cares what you do. So you can do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. It's only when you try to sell it or try to make it a form of property for yourself that anyone else even gets engaged, that any restraints come in.
Well, you know, we're dancing on the head of a philosophical pin, but if you create something, you're doing something for yourself. The part where your argument is very tempting is that you don't get any engagement, and you don't necessarily make the world a better place if you've made the greatest work of art and kept it to yourself. And so there is a way of looking at intellectual property law as the way that mediates that. But again, all of these things go to contextualizing the issue instead of making it an absolute. You know, the premise of this course in terms of looking at these things, from my perspective, is to get you away from the literal and to move you into a middle ground where you can decide where on the continuum you want to be.
So if I go to your house now and take this beautiful oak tree that's on your property and then inspired by an act of, I don't know, creativity to chop it down and build what I think is a wonderful sculpture, again on your property, that you find hideous, is that okay?
No, I don't think it's okay, because I think I have some moral right to the identity of what's, to my identity, and I see my property as my home as part of my identity. So I think I've got some sort of moral right.
What if it's a different piece of property?
I want to move it away from the notion of economic right. But I don't for a minute think I don't have a right.
So does it also apply if you own an investment property where you don't live and it's nothing but an asset to you, and then I go and take that investment property and do the same thing and lower the value of your investment by 20% because I killed a tree?
Then I think you do what the Supreme Court of Canada does, and there's a balancing act. And I think that's where the balance resides. And if you're looking for some sort of contractual literalism, nexus, consideration, consider that we're all creative. We all have that currency. And therefore, we're not stealing from each other. We're bartering. You may come onto my property, but I may go onto yours then. So there's a reciprocity to this. There's a reciprocity in the creative process that, again, only suggesting it takes us away from the literalness of the property word, which is what creates a lot of problems here. Andrew.
I was reading an article a few years ago where they were saying that they were positing that copyright, the fundamental underlying reasons for it were to foster creativity in the distribution of things. So they were saying that maybe in digital worlds, so maybe trees and yards notwithstanding, but maybe in the digital world, this is something that, well, you've already got these new digital distribution mechanisms, so it's not really as much a concern about whether or not something's getting distributed, and then you're just going back to weighing copyright versus property in the digital world might be different.
Very prescient. 3 slides from now, the Supreme Court of Canada says a version of exactly that, and I'm going to call it out for you. And it's a very curious statement unless you understand it exactly the way you just put it out there. So that's my son playing bass. The argument around barter and not being theft is there. The core of the argument is that, yes, it's tempting to say that copyright rewards storytelling, rewards creativity, but it also constrains that storytelling. And the dangerous thing in the digital world is it constrains the virality of it. And that's where you're likely, not likely, almost certainly to find the greater good. So I want to go to a more common, more well understood, and no less problematic legal principle. It's one of those great legal principles that everyone agrees with, except the courts keep finding exceptions while stating and restating its importance. And that is, prior restraints are bad. First-year constitutional law. Doesn't matter if it's first-year constitutional law in Canada or the United States or most countries in the world. Restraints on liberty are bad. Lots of exceptions. Consider, it was very interesting, I was at a conference on Friday in Philadelphia, And it's very interesting to hear speakers treat copyright law as a prior restraint and talk about it openly as a prior restraint. Oop. That's the extreme position. Slightly less extreme position, but actually the one that perhaps should be the most concerning. And you've seen this slide and versions of it 3 or 4 times in the course. Just want you to think about, as you go through the layers of control, the layers of restraint, the layers of constraint, that law creates, enables, enforces. How that distorts the creative process. That is a course unto itself, to track the layers. But ask yourself as a creator, and many of you are, as you go through each layer, how does this affect what I write, what I play, what I sing? And do that with every layer, and you will see. And each individual map of this will be different and will be a snowflake, but you'll start zigzagging all over the place. And it won't be a straight line, that I can assure you. My creative process will be changed and has to change because of this or that or the other thing. You got 10, 12 layers. And I'm not sure that there's an answer to that problem, because anarchy certainly isn't the answer. But it's important to be mindful of it as we figure out what to do about it, which is sort of the final slide. Okay.
I'm wondering, you really perhaps should unpack some of your assumptions about constraints as distorting. That's a value-laden sort of approach.
Yes?
Some of the very finest creative work is that which works around the constraints that are within a particular, and one of the most difficult positions for any artist is to be handed the complete, what they used to be metaphorically referred to as a completely blank slate, a blank canvas, the tyranny of the blank page, all of those sorts of elements where you have nothing to hang your specifically creative expression upon. And so I would be a tad careful in suggesting that all constraints are necessarily at odds with creativity. In many cases, they are the spurs.
Well, I agree with you in a very troubling example. And the troubling example, and I invite all of you to watch it, and you know what, I'll post it because it is certainly important enough to post, is A Wee Wee's version of Gangnam Style. It is cryptic. It is designed in a certain way as protest precisely because of restraints and constraints. But I think the truly creative person, yes, there is absolutely that terror of the blank page. Any creator knows the terror of the blank page, without a doubt. But I think we equally have to be careful on the other side to say, oh, setting up obstacles to creativity can be useful. Yes, they can be. But when you're creating something that's unintentionally forces you to work around, yes, it may force you to work harder, but I'm not sure at the end of the day truly creative people would prefer that.
So I'm thinking of this in two ways. Firstly, from a music way, and the second one from just, let's say, pictures of photographs and stuff.
Yeah.
So if I have to respect another person's copyright claim because they've created something, then really that just says to me, if I want to use it as they did it, I have to license it. If I don't want to use it as they did it, I have to change it enough to be different.
Yeah.
So I don't see I don't see a real wall blocking anything other than the mechanisms for licensing, which, as you know, I think about a lot.
Right.
Second, if you switch it out of the music context.
Can I just take you just
Sure.
slightly back,
Yeah.
only slightly back, and that's to say that depends on where the threshold lies for your new work. If it's, if the threshold for the creative is extremely low and it encompasses a very wide range, then you may find that your derivative work still breaches copyright, even if it's some significant way different. And there's lots of cases along those lines. So somewhere in there is the balance. So yeah, you're in exactly the right place.
Absolutely. Now, if you take it to let's say, famous, paintings. Let's say the point that I want to make, and I'm trying to be creative, and I want to make a statement. So I take 10 amazing historical paintings that have their own entire, point that they've made, and I just create a poster, and each one is different sizes based on what I'm trying to say. And if you look at my thing and you know the history of these paintings, you're going to get an immense message from this. So either I'm building on what they're doing so much that is the work I'm doing, in which case maybe I should license it, and otherwise I have to paint something different.
Right. And so you've put your finger on the question. And the question is, should that compilation, which somehow, because it was core to your question, that it delivers in its entirety, you've got the 10 greatest paintings in the world, and somehow the way they've been put together by a creator creates a new experience. So that's an assumption in this question. Should that be allowed or shouldn't it? That is the question. That's the question of mods. That's largely the question of, well, do I take IP literally and say, well, no, we're not going to allow this creativity that will benefit the world because IP must be taken as a literal property, or the balance doesn't go that way, or does it? So this is, you've heard versions of this before, but this is a very small attempt to reconcile IP literalisms, privacy literalisms, and contractual literalisms that all go in slightly different ways. And I actually kind of made the statement. Those ones and zeros are of me. So that's the personal Hollywood theory of creativity. They therefore are my property. Now we're into IP, a little bit of privacy. Therefore, I can do what I want with them, control them in any way I wish, which is privacy and contract. Remember, this is a philosophy lecture, so don't expect any answers. That said, try and get out of the thicket a little bit.
What happens if you create a work of art? It has a meaning when you've done it. 1,000 years from now, someone finds your work of art. They don't know you. They have no idea what your meaning was. The work takes on a different meaning because it's now an artifact. It's a piece of archaeology.
Yeah.
What's happened is that that whole tenuous association with identity, personal identity, becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
Because you can't reconstruct what it was. The work has a different context.
Right.
We have things like the stele of Naram Sin, comes from about 3200 BC, or a little sooner than that, but basically about 2,000–3,000 years ago. It was put up to celebrate the king's victory over someplace else on the border place. 1,000 years later, somebody takes the thing home. Now it lives, I believe, in the Louvre. But essentially, we view it in an entirely different way. We can't read the language, well, we can read the language of some of them now, but basically that's only because of lots of study. The meaning in any given expression in tangible property is not fixed. It does not stay that way forever. It's only because it is being manipulated for notions of ownership that we have this whole process of copyright and IP.
So can we just add one thing to your brilliant exposition, which is entirely correct, and that is that the digital world is another, it has a similar effect to the passage of time, because it completely distorts the bubble. So time distorts the bubble of meaning, and the digital world distorts the bubble of meaning, and many of the same principles should apply.
But if we were to go to something much more recent, we have Marcel Duchamp does a painting, very famous painting, the most famous painting, the Mona Lisa. He takes a reproduction of it in 1917. He puts a mustache on it, and he puts down at the bottom of it a pun. She cool. She has a hot ass. Okay, that becomes in 1917 a work that is in every art history textbook today as an example of Dadaist art, of the new modernism and things like that. It's totally different from Leonardo's version of the painting that happened before, but it's within the last few years. And the whole thing is that he is using some of the baggage that had been associated with Da Vinci's painting, that's history, in his new expression. And Duchamp himself would often say to various critics, people like Donald Cuspit and whatnot, that if they suggested a meaning for his work, his answer was, it could mean that. In other words, the audience were the people who created the aesthetic experience.
Exactly, and it always is, and that goes back to the art criticism text that I quoted earlier, where the audience is more valuable, and again, that translates back into games in terms of mods and user-created content. So I'm going to go quickly through the rest, but it's just a reminder to you of things we've talked about throughout. So enter moral rights as a way of dealing with some of these conundrums. Attribution and integrity. You can apply them to the IP problems, to the privacy problems. Right to be forgotten as a way of applying moral rights to the privacy problem. You run aground on how you apply moral rights in a contractual setting. Now, we know technically you can waive your moral rights, you can't assign them, but it kind of runs aground. Interesting footnote, our new Copyright Act extends moral rights to performers in their performances, and ask yourself how that applies in a video game setting to Twitch TV, to someone who's doing a voiceover, which is a performance. When I read the sections, and you should read them for yourself, it's pretty interesting. So Supreme Court of Canada. Couple of quotes out of the pentology that I just want to leave you with, because they really go to this. And Andrew raised these issues. This is, in both cases, Madam Justice Sabella. Fair dealing is a user's right, and the relevant perspective when considering whether the dealing is for an allowable purpose is that of the user. So the perspective to be used is not the perspective of the copyright holder. It is the perspective of the user. That's a really significant statement about where the balance lies. And it is much more user right and mod friendly than you might expect. Now, the second point is the specific one that we were talking about earlier. Reflect this through the entire corpus of the course. Further, given the ease and magnitude with which digital works are disseminated over the internet, focusing on the aggregate amount of the dealing in cases involving digital works could well lead to disproportionate findings of unfairness when compared with non-digital works. So we're not going to take this intellectual property thing too seriously, in a sense. We take it seriously, but if it's going to fly off the handle because of the ease of copying ones and zeros, we're going to look at the basic purpose, which is the greater good behind IP law, and we're going to adjust, in a sense, down to an analog standard. We're going to hold the analog standard of the analog standard of infringement in a digital world and readjust to that standard. So we're not going to take copyright that literally. And this is the Supreme Court of Canada, and this is why the pentology is so important. In this context, I just remind you again of Sony and Universal, which was the Betamax case, which we've talked about, and the most recent version of it, which is seen by many as being a version of Sony and Universal, which was just decided, the VO case, which is a DMCA safe harbor case about posting of videos online, and where VO was protected for doing that, even though it enabled all sorts of tools. And finally, almost finally, we come to Section 2921, non-commercial user-generated content in the Copyright Act. So this is the new user-generated content provision. And if you are doing something solely for non-commercial purpose, and it's reasonable to do so. So there's lots of interpretation yet to happen by the courts around this provision. I don't know that it's been judicially considered as yet. It's obviously a brand new provision. But there are versions of the right to mod, the right to machinima, the right to remix for private purposes that would seem to be the clear intent of the statute, which takes us back to the courts. Very brave piece by law professor at Georgetown, who was actually at the conference on Friday, who says, the future of fair use as a formal doctrine in the United States depends on whether judges act like bad reviewers on Amazon.com or whether they behave differently in interpreting challenged works than they do in almost every other aspect of judging. She is saying this is tough stuff. You have to really parse and understand. And if you're sloppy and simplistic and literalistic, you will come to the wrong decision on these questions. Which leads us to why have we barely talked about video games for the last hour? And what does this have to do with video games? So this is right back to the first class. The premise of this course, which hopefully has been demonstrated at least somewhat, is that the importance of video game law is not in video games, but in the unique crossroads that video games represent, because they bring together and force legal issues in freedom of expression, intellectual property, and contract law like nothing else, because of the cutting edge, because of the degree of interactivity, because where the technology keeps going and keeps changing and keeps forcing things. Think video games in the box and now moving with Ingress and Google Glass potentially out of the box. And that's the point of the course. So I've got a couple of thank yous to make. First, to once a colleague of yours, Tim Luck, a great athlete who tragically passed away doing something that I know he loved, but still needlessly. He was a student here, student in my media and entertainment law class, and one day when we were working together in a law firm, he said, I'll gather all of the materials so you can write a book on video game law, because I know that's what you really want to do. So the reason you're sitting here today has got a considerable amount to do with Tim, and he should be acknowledged. I want to acknowledge Rock, who has done a great deal for me, a great deal for the course, has posted a lot, and provides a lot of support. So thank you, Rock. And the last thanks, in my tradition, there's a beautiful saying which I really feel very strongly about. I have learned much from my teachers, more from my peers, but from my students most of all. So that is really true. It's been true for 25 years. It remains more true than ever because of you guys. Thank you for everything you've contributed. Thank you for going on the blog and doing things with no expectations, just because it's fun and interesting. I hope you've enjoyed the course as a tenth as much as I've enjoyed giving it. So we're going to take a 2-minute break, and we're going to go to our guest, Steve Reckschaffner, who I put no pressure on. I said, Steve, who understands psychology well, knows all about the theory of latency, and I just said everything that the students are going to remember about the course, because this is the last class of the year, will be entirely dependent on the half hour he delivers. So I did really want you to hear, you've heard my blather about what the future of gaming looks like, and it's really important that you actually hear from someone who's a producer and knows what they're talking about. So thank you very much. Thanks for being here and listening all this time.